Today's story is one that you might think you know. It's been covered extensively online, particularly because of the very strange and unsettling piece of audio associated with it. I'm talking, of course, about the final voicemail of Henry McCabe. To be honest, I was in this same camp myself until a few months ago, when a viewer suggested it as a case that we should think about covering. As I started revisiting it, though, I began to learn that there was so much more to all of this than I ever realized. It's a case that completely sucked me in, which is why I now want to share it with all of you. I'm going to be completely upfront. Today's story is a mystery. This situation is still unresolved, and I can't offer you a neat resolution at the end. What I will try to do, though, is to dig below the surface of a case that admits of no easy answers. It's one with a complex web of events and characters, which I will do my best to break down and present in the most straightforward way possible. One more thing before we dive in. I'd like to give a huge shout out to fellow YouTube content creator, The Missing Enigma. He was kind enough to help us obtain the police report for this case, which is what we based a large amount of the information in this video on. If you're interested in stories like this, you should definitely give his channel a look after this. He also has a video about this case as well. Alright, with all that said, this is the disturbing last voicemail of Henry McCabe. At 31 years old, Henry Toby McCabe was the definition of an American immigrant success story. After coming to the United States with very little, he had built a life, a wonderful family, and had big dreams for the future. Henry was born in the early 1980s in the West African nation of Liberia. He and his family were originally from Lofa County, an area in the far north of the country, but Henry had grown up and attended school in the capital city of Monrovia. Henry had lived here into his teens, but sadly before he could finish high school, he and his brothers were forced to flee their home. This was not an unusual thing at the time. For those unfamiliar, beginning in the late 1980s, Liberia went through a time of extreme political instability. The nation was plunged into two bloody civil wars that didn't end until well into the 2000s. After escaping the violence, like hundreds of thousands of others, Henry spent the next several years living in a refugee camp in Ghana. He stayed there until 2003, when he got the opportunity to start a new life in America. Upon arriving in the country, Henry settled in California and quickly made the most of the chance that he'd been given. He enrolled in university to study accounting and economics, where he earned scholarships and became an honors student. He would eventually graduate with a double bachelor's degree in both fields. About a year after coming to the US, Henry met the woman who would become his wife, Corrine Wade. The pair were introduced at a party thrown by some other members of the Liberian immigrant community. Henry was immediately taken with Corrine, and very shortly after they started talking, he asked for her contact info. Normally in these types of situations, with a very forward guy like this who she had just met, Corrine would give out a fake number, but something about Henry told her that he was different. Her intuition turned out to be correct. Corrine quickly fell for Henry's charismatic personality, his kindness, and his drive to succeed. They bonded over him teaching her how to cook African food, and in just a few months' time, they were married. The following year, they had their first child together, a daughter named Eve. In 2012, the young family decided to pick up and move to the Twin Cities area of Minnesota. Not only is this region home to one of the US's largest Liberian communities, but Henry was able to get a good job as a corporate auditor with the Minnesota Department of Revenue. They settled in Mounds View, a city just a few miles north of Minneapolis, and quickly began to put down roots. It helped that they had some family in the area, including one of Henry's older brothers, Timothy. Not long after arriving there, Henry and Corrine also welcomed their second child into the world, another daughter named Ivy. Like Corrine, pretty much everyone who got to know Henry admired the kind of person he was. He had this seemingly endless optimism, and he was friendly and outgoing. Among his coworkers, he was known as the guy who was always sharing his lunch and introducing them to new foods. As I previously mentioned, the other thing Henry was known for was his ambition. He wanted great things for his life, and had set himself some pretty big goals. One of those was eventually to return to Liberia and become the president of the place that he had once called home. According to those that were close to him, Henry definitely had the passion to back this up. He spent a ton of his time thinking and writing and reading about politics, and would discuss policy, social issues, and topics he was interested in with pretty much anyone who would listen. Even in his free time, one of his favorite things to do was to listen to intelligence squared debates. Of course, Henry knew that achieving everything he had set his mind to would take time. Before entertaining any kind of political aspirations, he wanted to get further in his career. He began working towards both becoming a certified public accountant and earning his master's degree, all while continuing with his full-time job and raising his 2 girls. Sadly, what neither Henry nor anyone else around him knew was that he had far less time than he realized. Right at the end of the summer of 2015, something would happen, an event that would not only baffle Henry's loved ones, but would become a source of enduring mystery to this day. Just before 10 a.m. on the morning of September 8th, 2015, the Mounds View Police Department received a phone call from Henry's brother, Timothy. Timothy said that he wanted to report Henry missing. He wasn't home, wasn't answering his phone, and no one had seen or heard from him in over a day. At the time of the call, Timothy was at Henry's apartment, a complex on the 5500 block of Landmark Circle. He gave police the address, and a couple of officers came out to meet him. Upon arriving, Timothy showed the officers that the front door to Henry's unit was unlocked, which he said was how he had found it. When they went inside, they didn't see anything suspicious, nor anything that appeared to be missing or out of place. Henry's car was even still parked in the complex's lot outside. However, there was no sign of him anywhere. Timothy explained that the last time he had spoken to his brother was 3 days earlier, on September 5th, the Saturday of the Labor Day weekend. Henry was acting completely normal, and nothing that they talked about gave him any cause for concern. Police asked Timothy if Henry had any history of depression or mental health issues, but he said no, there was nothing like that. He said that since yesterday, every call he made to his brother's phone went straight to voicemail, and that he had tried calling every local hospital he could think of, but that this had also come up empty. The officers stated that they would look into all of this, but advised Timothy to contact them again if Henry happened to reach out. Now, you're probably wondering, where were Corrine and the couple's 2 kids? Well, they were actually back in California visiting Corrine's family. They had been there since August 14th and weren't due to return for a little while still. That being said, Corrine wasn't far behind Timothy with a report of her own. When she spoke with Mounds View Police later that same day, she said that she also hadn't been able to reach her husband, and that the last time she had spoken to Henry was in the early morning hours of September 7th. Corrine elaborated on what she knew in a second, longer conversation with police on September 9th. By this time, she said she had spoken to some of Henry's friends and had gotten a better idea of what he was doing that past weekend. In particular, she had talked with a guy named Jonathan Thomas. She said Jonathan told her that he was at a club with Henry on Sunday night, and that Henry had left early the next morning with a guy she only knew by the nickname Pappas. Pappas had supposedly given Henry a ride during the time that she had last spoken to him over the phone at 2:23 a.m. During that call, she said Henry sounded delirious. She was concerned enough that she had actually called Timothy to try and see if he would go and pick Henry up, but Timothy didn't answer. After speaking with Corrine, Mounds View Police reached out to Jonathan Thomas, who confirmed pretty much everything she had told them. He said that, yeah, he and Henry had both been at a club together that night. The club was called C'est La Vie, and it was hosted inside of another club called Pavlitsky's on 65. In case you're wondering, it was named that because, you guessed it, it was owned by a guy named Pavlitsky, and it was right next to Highway 65. Anyway, Jonathan said that nothing bad had happened at the club that night, but Henry did have a lot to drink. It also sounded like he might have gotten into an altercation at some point on his cell phone. Jonathan stated that the Pappas guy that Corrine had mentioned was actually named William Kennedy. He said that William had given Henry a ride that night, and that he had spoken to Henry after he and William left the club. Henry claimed that he was at home, but it didn't sound like he was. When Jonathan questioned him about this, Henry said he was basically home, about a minute away. That's why he hadn't been overly concerned. This made sense until police sat down with William Kennedy. That's when they would learn the first of what would turn out to be many strange details related to Henry's disappearance. You see, according to William, he did not drop Henry home. Not because he hadn't tried, but because he claimed Henry didn't want him to. William told investigators that he had driven Henry both to and from C'est La Vie that night. On their way there, they had stopped at a TCF bank where Henry had withdrawn some money. When they arrived at the club, William said that Henry spent most of his time with Jonathan. But when it was time to leave, he came over to his vehicle and got in the passenger seat. He was on the phone at the time, and it sounded like he was arguing with his wife. Not long after, he appeared to hang up on her. William explained he didn't really know where he was going, so while Henry was on the phone, he just started driving south down Highway 65. When Henry got off his call, he asked him where his apartment was, but he said Henry wouldn't tell him. Instead, he asked to be dropped off at a gas station a little ways down the road. William claimed that he made it clear to Henry that he was willing to drive him home, but he said Henry was very insistent. He said he dropped him off at a Super America station near Highway 65 and 73rd Avenue. He was pretty sure that that was sometime between 2 and 2:15. In other words, about 10 minutes before Corrine claimed she last spoke with Henry. William stated that the last time he saw Henry, he was walking towards the side of the gas station. After that, William said he drove straight home. Understandably, this whole situation was already pretty weird. Why had Henry demanded to be dropped off at a gas station in the middle of the night, especially one so far from his home? Just for reference, that Super America station was 2.5 miles away from Henry's apartment. For most people, that's about an hour's walk. That's not even the only reason this decision would have been questionable. As we'll see, Henry also didn't have his wallet or his keys when he was dropped off that night. But we'll get to that a little later. First, we have to tackle the part of this story that most of you are probably familiar with if you've heard of this case before. Something that would quickly become the core of this disturbing mystery. On September 14th, 2015, so a week after Henry's disappearance, Mounds View police sat down with Corrine for a third interview. They were there to discuss a new piece of evidence, a voicemail which had been recorded during Corrine's final phone call with Henry on the morning of September 7th. It's not clear when authorities first learned about the voicemail, but what we do know is that this conversation on September 14th is the first mention of it in the police report. There's something else that's worth explaining here too, and that's how this voicemail was actually recorded. When I originally heard about this case, pretty much all of the articles and sources I came across talking about it stated that Henry had called Corrine and left this voicemail on her cell phone. However, that's not true. According to the police report, the message was actually the result of Corrine initiating a three-way call with Timothy. If you'll recall, Corrine had told police she was concerned about the way Henry was acting and had tried to contact Timothy, but he didn't pick up. When she attempted that three-way call, it went to Timothy's answering machine, and this is how the voicemail was created. So yeah, Corrine was already on the phone with Henry at this point. As I said, their conversation had started at 2:23 a.m. The voicemail began recording several minutes into this call, until Henry's phone abruptly cut off at 2:28. The full voicemail is about 2 minutes long, and we're going to play you the whole thing in just a second. Before we do, though, a couple of quick notes. First of all, we're not going to be captioning the call in any way. I've seen a lot of videos out there that have attempted to do this, but to be honest, I've listened to this a ton of times, and pretty much everything that's said is unintelligible. Not only that, but there's a well-documented effect that captioning things like this has on our brain's ability to perceive them. So anything we put on the screen would essentially be a form of influencing you to hear what we think you should hear. Instead, we want you to draw your own conclusions. The second point is that although we don't know what's being said, the vibe here is still quite eerie and it's unsettling to hear. So just keep that in mind before you listen. Anyway, here it is. I've heard this call described in many ways, and people claim to hear any number of things in it. Animal noises, growling, even full-on conversations. The police report describes it this way. Quote, "The voicemail is very hard to discern, but it sounds as though Henry is talking to someone and he is grunting and yelling, then he talks some more to someone, then he is screaming and crying and the call cuts out." During her meeting with police, Corrine said that what struck her most about the audio was that it didn't sound like her husband. Henry was usually so intelligent and articulate, and to hear these awful noises coming from him was extremely upsetting. She said that when she had talked to Henry in the lead up to this call, it sounded like he was intoxicated and slurring his words, but this was a whole other level. Now, up until this point, it was safe to say that people were worried about Henry. The fact that he had been missing for a week was very out of character for him, but this voicemail was the first real indication that Henry might be in serious danger. When portions of the audio were released to the public, most people agreed, especially Henry's loved ones and members of the local Liberian community. Many would volunteer their time in a number of searches that were carried out in the coming days and weeks. Even so, the question remained, what had actually happened to Henry in the lead up to this final phone call? And more importantly, who or what had caused him to make it? In order to figure that out, police decided they needed to retrace Henry's steps. They would do this by seeking out additional evidence to put together a comprehensive timeline. Over the next few days, Mounds View police conducted several more interviews, largely with people that they had already talked to prior. For the sake of time and clarity, I'm not going to go over all of these interviews individually. Instead, I'll just give you a sense of the new details police learned. Most of the new information came from William Kennedy and Jonathan Thomas. During these new interviews, William explained that he had been at a barbecue on September 6th when Henry had shown up. The barbecue was hosted by a mutual friend of theirs named Emmanuel D., who lived in Brooklyn Park, a suburb just a little west of Mounds View. Police would later find out that Henry hadn't actually been invited to this barbecue. He only learned about it when he called Jonathan, who was also there. Henry was kind of annoyed at Emmanuel, but Emmanuel said he was more than welcome to come. Henry hopped in his car and had headed over, getting there around 8:30 p.m. William said that things started winding down about an hour after Henry arrived, but a bunch of people were looking for something to do afterwards. They decided that they would go to Club C'est La Vie. There was a little time to kill in between, and Henry wanted to drop off his car at his apartment, so William said that he would follow him there and agreed to give him a ride afterwards. He said he did this because he knew if he went home, his wife would make him stay in for the night. He estimated that they left Emmanuel's place sometime after 10 and had gotten to Henry's apartment around 10:30. After hanging out there for a while, William said that they left together and started heading towards the club. They stopped briefly at TCF Bank, where Henry used the ATM. By this point, police had confirmed this detail with the bank. There was actually surveillance footage they were able to review, which placed Henry there at 11:24 p.m. In the video, it was clear that Henry had already been drinking quite a bit. According to the police report, he looked unsteady on his feet and walked up to a drive-through ATM in the parking lot. He withdrew $200, then could be seen urinating in a corner before running across the lot. William said he got back in his car and they drove straight to the club. Most of the rest of William's story was the same as before. He said they'd left shortly before 2 a.m., he dropped Henry off at the gas station, and that was the last he'd seen of him. As for what happened while they were at the club, most of those new details came from Jonathan. Jonathan said that when he arrived at C'est La Vie, Henry was already there. It looked like he was having a pretty good time, too. As soon as Henry spotted Jonathan, he came right over and gave him a hug. Strangely, he also whipped out his wallet and gave it to him. Jonathan said that when he asked Henry what he was doing, he replied, quote, "Remember, I owe you. I didn't take you out for your birthday." Now, Jonathan thought this was pretty weird, but he said he held on to Henry's wallet anyway because he figured he probably didn't need any more drinks. This didn't work, though, as Henry ended up ordering more for him and some of their other friends shortly after. He said that he had intended to give Henry back his wallet, but he left the club without saying goodbye. By the time Jonathan realized this, he also had a missed call from Henry, which had come in at 1:50 a.m. 19 minutes later, at 2:09 a.m., Jonathan got a call from Corrine saying that Henry was, quote, acting crazy. This is when Jonathan had called Henry back and they had had that conversation about him being a minute away from home. At the time, Jonathan said that Henry didn't seem at all concerned or worried. If anything, he seemed annoyed by Corrine trying to talk to him. She was apparently giving him a hard time about him going out because he was supposed to be at home studying for his CPA exam. He told Jonathan, quote, "Don't mind that woman. She drives me crazy." Jonathan said it wasn't until Corrine called him again 17 hours later that he realized Henry never made it back to his apartment. To summarize, here's the timeline as police understood it at this point. On September 6th, Henry arrived at Emmanuel's barbecue around 8:30 p.m. He hung out there until about 10 when he and William went back to his apartment. The pair got there at 10:30 and stayed until leaving for the club. On their way there, they stopped at TCF Bank, where Henry used the ATM at 11:24. William and Henry made it to the club about 5 to 10 minutes later. He stayed there until about 1:45, when Henry got back in William's car and they started driving south down Highway 65. William dropped Henry off at the Super America at 73rd Avenue sometime between 2 and 2:15. Finally, at 2:23 a.m., Henry had his last phone call with Corrine. The call cut off at 2:28, right during the middle of the disturbing voicemail recording. As I previously mentioned, Mounds View police had the TCF Bank footage, so they knew for sure that this part of the timeline was airtight. They were also able to get Henry's cell phone records, which further confirmed a lot of what they had been told by Corrine, Jonathan, and William. However, there was one pretty major piece of all of this that would soon be thrown into question. It began when they obtained the surveillance footage from the Super America station at Highway 65 and 73rd Avenue. No matter how much investigators scoured the footage, they couldn't find any evidence that Henry or William had been there on the morning of the disappearance. After failing to find proof that William had dropped Henry off where he had repeatedly claimed, Mounds View police were understandably suspicious. William was already the last confirmed person to see Henry before he vanished, and the idea of him dropping his friend off in this way in the middle of the night had always sounded strange. As I alluded to earlier, though, there was actually even more about this that was questionable. You see, William was also in possession of Henry's keys at the time that he was reported missing. William admitted this when he was interviewed, but said that he wasn't aware that he had the keys when he dropped Henry off. He claimed that Henry had left them in one of the cup holders of his car, and he hadn't noticed this until later. For many, this would be enough on its own to convince them that William was somehow involved in Henry's disappearance. One person in particular, though, would come forward with some pretty startling allegations against him. On September 17th, so 10 days after Henry went missing, police sat down with a confidential informant. We don't know the identity of this informant, because that's sort of the point. But this person claimed that they had known Henry for a long time, and that they had talked a lot about his political ambitions in Liberia. The CI proceeded to tell police that he believed Henry was dead, and that William Kennedy had killed him. He said that he was coming forward mainly because he wanted his friend to receive a proper burial. As far as we can tell, the CI never explained exactly how he supposedly knew all of this, though he did talk about some strange behavior he claimed to have observed amongst Henry's friends. Among them, Emmanuel D., the guy who had hosted that barbecue, as well as another friend named Calvin Johnson. The CI stated that on September 12th, he had been participating in one of the searches that had been organized for Henry when he spotted a group of 4 guys standing and talking together off to one side. Emmanuel and Calvin were both part of that group, and he said that when he walked over there, they immediately quieted down and split up. It's not clear why, but at this point, the CI became confrontational. He approached one of the men right away and said, quote, "I know you know what happened to my friend." He told police he also called another one of these men later that same day with a similar accusation. Both of them denied knowing anything. However, the CI claimed that when he spoke to Calvin and Emmanuel, they acted cagey. It's worth pointing out that he was even more confrontational with them, accusing William Kennedy directly of murdering Henry and demanding that Calvin and Emmanuel tell him why. Still, their responses were a little strange. Both men refused to talk about what had happened over the phone, and instead said that they would only discuss things in person. The CI claimed that Calvin did eventually talk with him over the phone, but it was only to ask why he was saying these things about William. The CI stated that he said, quote, "because it's true and you know it," though again, did not elaborate on how he had come to this conclusion. The final thing that the CI told police has to do with Henry's last voicemail, which he claimed he had heard. He said that when he listened, he believed he could make out some of what Henry was saying in the call. At one point, he thought he had yelled that he was from Lofa County. Later on, he believed he heard Henry claiming he had VOO, essentially warning people around him that they would be possessed by a demon if they hurt him. The CI believed Henry was doing this out of desperation, and at the end of the voicemail was screaming for help. Police did eventually speak with both Calvin and Emmanuel, but neither man's statement was really all that interesting. Their stories pretty closely matched what investigators had already been told by all of the previous witnesses, and they claimed that they didn't know anything about what had happened to Henry. They also said that William's story had remained consistent since the beginning, and he hadn't been acting strangely either before or since Henry went missing. Mounds View police would conduct one final interview with William Kennedy, but before we get there, I want to touch on a couple of other strange and noteworthy developments. The first is an anonymous letter that was received by the New Brighton Police Department on October 2nd. The letter was postmarked from the previous day and had been sent from St. Paul. Here's what it said. Quote, "Henry McCabe, his body next to water, partially buried, needs search dog to find. Witness who saw burial, scared, female, young. Asked to come forward, can remain anonymous, and will protect." Like with the confidential informant, the letter suggested that Henry was dead and that there was foul play involved in his disappearance. Though it stopped short of actually accusing anyone directly, the idea that there were other witnesses who might be able to shed light on what had happened was intriguing. Unfortunately, the letter was fairly cryptic, and while it was sent off for analysis, nothing that could help identify the sender was found. The police report states that there was insufficient DNA for testing and no prints suitable for comparison. A much more consequential clue was found, though, when Corrine reached out to investigators on October 9th. She said that she had discovered something on the Google account connected to Henry's phone, called Google Maps Timeline. This is a feature that works with your phone's location services to remember routes that you've traveled. And it turned out there was some pretty important data on there from the morning of September 7th. By this time, Mounds View police had obtained a separate search warrant for the geolocation information on Henry's phone, but this just showed general areas where the device had pinged cell towers. Don't get me wrong, it was helpful. In fact, it showed that previous searches for Henry had been focused in the wrong areas. That being said, the Google timeline data was a lot more detailed. The data showed that after leaving the club that morning, Henry's phone had traveled down Highway 65, but it had gone quite a bit further south than initially thought, roughly 2 miles. Instead of stopping at 73rd Avenue, the phone had stopped at the intersection of Highway 65 and Old Central Avenue. From here, the phone had gone north up Old Central Avenue until it started heading east down Rice Creek Road. The phone continued until the intersection of Rice Creek Road and Benjamin Street. No one could say for sure what happened at this point, but the phone either stopped functioning or the GPS services were turned off. The most interesting thing about this by far, though, was that initial point where the phone had briefly stopped, Highway 65 and Old Central Avenue. You see, there was another gas station right here. Instead of a Super America, though, it was a Holiday. When police obtained surveillance from the station, they found footage of Henry being dropped off there on the morning of September 7th. The vehicle he was traveling in was consistent with the one William Kennedy said he had been driving, and other than it being the wrong location, everything about this pretty much aligned with what he had been telling them since the beginning. The video showed Henry getting out of the car at 1:58 a.m., after which he had started walking and William had driven away. So, going back to our timeline, Almost everything remained the same. The only major differences were that Henry's final conversation with Jonathan and Corinne had definitely happened after he had been dropped off. That, and he was actually even farther away from home than police initially thought. The obvious question was, had William just made a mistake about the drop-off, or was he hiding something? This was part of what was discussed in that last interview with police I mentioned, which took place on October 13th. When asked about the discrepancy in his story, William told investigators that it was indeed a mistake. He claimed that he was never actually 100% sure about the Super America station, and that he had only said this after he learned about Henry's disappearance and revisited the area to try and jog his memory. On the morning in question, William said that he had been kind of thrown off by the way things had played out. He stated that while he had agreed to give Henry a ride to the club, they had never discussed a ride home. In fact, he said he was surprised when Henry got in his car as he was heading out, because Henry had told him earlier he was going to be getting a ride with a different friend. Once again, William reiterated that Henry was on the phone and appeared to be arguing with his wife. He said that he just started driving and must not have realized how far he'd gone down Highway 65. He said he got home at about 2:25 that morning, something that his wife backed up. William also told police that he thought it was strange everyone thought he and Henry were so close. He explained they'd only actually met one other time before that night, and that he didn't understand why people were blaming him for what had happened and accusing him of lying. He admitted that he had also been drinking that night, but said not so much that he hadn't been aware. He likewise claimed that he didn't think Henry was in that rough of shape either. With no real evidence to suggest that William had done anything wrong, police were forced to pursue other lines of investigation. Given the amount of people who had commented on Henry's apparent level of intoxication on the morning that he went missing, they wondered if there might have been some kind of accident. They also looked into whether Henry might have gone missing of his own accord, or whether he might have intentionally harmed himself. Those close to Henry were adamant that all of these theories were unlikely, but especially the last two. When asked about whether Henry might have gone back to Liberia, Corinne stated it would have been almost impossible. He didn't have the proper paperwork to go back, and even if he somehow got there, he probably wouldn't have been able to avoid people he knew there, especially his mother. As for the idea he had intentionally hurt himself, loved ones said that he never would have done this and had no reason to. But that wasn't entirely true. According to interviews with Henry's supervisor at the Minnesota Department of Revenue, Henry had been under quite a bit of stress with a corporate audit he was doing. He was under a lot of pressure to get it finished, and had also had a poor work review just over a month prior. The supervisor told police he had spoken with some other employees there who stated that Henry was thinking about moving back to California. He expressed that he had some, quote, emotions over family troubles, but never got into the specifics. Now, the reasons for Henry's supposed family troubles are not super well explored in the police report, but there are indications that he and Corinne's marriage may have been a bit rockier than people realized. In one interview with Corinne, she referred to previous instances in which she had caught Henry being unfaithful. Again, though, the police report doesn't delve too far into this. What does seem to be true is that there were multiple people who had their suspicions about Corinne and her role in all of this. Not so much from the perspective that she had hurt Henry, but that she wasn't being entirely truthful with authorities. At least two people came forward claiming this. The first was Timothy. The second was a man named David Singleton. I haven't really mentioned David Singleton up until now, just because there are already so many moving parts to this story. But what you should know is that he was involved in this case from very early on. At the time, David was the CEO of an organization called Minnesota Community Policing Services. Despite what the name might suggest, the company is in no way connected to law enforcement. If you're kind of getting a weird vibe from this, yeah, there's some stuff out there about this organization, but it's beyond the scope of this video. All you really need to know for our purposes is that the MCPS had come in initially at the request of Corinne and Henry's other family members. Not only had David and the group helped to organize a ton of the searches for Henry, but he had also helped to raise a $10,000 reward for information about his disappearance. The reason all of this is important is because David and Corinne had a pretty big public split over these assertions that she wasn't being fully honest with police. The key claim made by both David and Timothy was that Corinne was telling people she knew Henry was alive, but that she couldn't say how she knew this. They also alleged she was trying to control information and was withholding evidence. Corinne was questioned about this on October 23rd, but claimed that most of this was a misunderstanding. She said that her belief that Henry was alive was just based on a feeling, and that she had given police everything she had. One other thing Corinne was asked about was something you might also have wondered, and that's why she never tried to call Henry back after the disturbing voicemail was recorded. For this, Corinne had a much less satisfying answer. She told police she was simply tired, and that she didn't really hear what Henry was saying at the time because she was busy trying to set up the three-way call with Timothy. At this point, police had a ton of information, a bunch of different evidence and statements, but very little of this was coming together. It all seemed to be pointing in different directions, and what was worse, they were still no closer to finding Henry. As it happened, that was about to change, though it wasn't in the way that anyone had hoped. Shortly after 4 p.m. on November 2nd, so 55 days after Henry was first reported missing, police received a 911 call from a person who said that they needed to report possible human remains. The caller said that they had been kayaking in the city of New Brighton when they came across what they believed was a body. When officers arrived at the scene, they quickly confirmed the disturbing discovery. The body of a man was found floating in the water on the east side of Rush Lake, one of several small lakes in the area. The body was sent off to the Ramsey County Medical Examiner's office, where dental records confirmed everyone's worst fears. These were the remains of Henry McCabe. Understandably, the news came as a heartbreaking blow to Henry's friends and family, most of whom had now spent weeks worrying and searching for him. Still, initially there was some hope that the discovery would bring with it much-needed answers. Sadly, that's not what would happen. An autopsy report completed on November 18th determined that Henry's cause of death was probable drowning in fresh water. There was no evidence of traumatic injuries to his body, though the manner of death could not be determined. Toxicology analysis, meanwhile, showed that the blood alcohol content of Henry's liver was 0.053. You might be thinking to yourself, that's below the legal limit for driving in most states. So why did Henry sound so messed up in that voicemail? Well, the ME was quick to point out that there was water in Henry's body cavity, so this had likely diluted the amount of alcohol in his system. Other than his wallet and keys, which we already discussed, it seemed like Henry had all of his possessions at the time that he was found. He was wearing his gold wedding band and watch, he had a VIP wristband from the nightclub, and there was some of that cash he had withdrawn still in one of his pockets. What was a little strange, though, was Henry's cell phone. The body of his Samsung was in the right pocket of his shorts, while the battery for the phone was in his left. In the opinion of investigators, none of this indicated foul play. In the police report, they stopped short of sharing any affirmative theories, though they state that based on the location data from Henry's phone, they believe that if he continued walking east on Rice Creek Road, it would have been more than possible for him to end up in Rush Lake. The report lays it out this way. Quote, if Henry had kept walking down Rice Creek Road, he would have come to a T intersection at Long Lake Road. He could have followed Long Lake and Mississippi around Long Lake, which end in a series of trails between Long Lake and Rush Lake. This is approximately 3 miles from where Henry was dropped off. As you might imagine, Henry's loved ones were not satisfied with this explanation, and they continued to believe that a person or a group of people had to have been responsible for his death. They attempted to press police for further answers about what had happened, but unfortunately, it seems not much came of this. Instead, the announcement that Henry's body had been successfully recovered would be one of the last public statements about the case that authorities would make. As far as we can tell, that remains true to this day. Henry McCabe's funeral was held on December 19th of that year, with more than 500 people packing into the Brooklyn United Methodist Church for the service. According to reports from the time, it was an extremely emotional event, with one of the most heartbreaking moments being when Henry's 10-year-old daughter got up to speak, asking the crowd, quote, "Why did he have to die like this?" and referring to the loss of her father as the worst punishment ever. Even 9 years later, we still have far more questions than answers about the disappearance and death of Henry McCabe. For Henry's loved ones, his absence is likely a wound that can never fully heal, but there's still a hope that one day a resolution to this mystery might offer some semblance of closure. I told you at the beginning of the video that none of this was going to be neatly tied up at the end. I stand by that, but I still wanted to go over a few theories and loose ends just to kind of lay out some of the popular ideas about this case. There are way too many of these out there to go over all of them, so apologies if I don't address something that you think is important. You can always drop it in the comment section below, though, and we'll try to take a look at it. In terms of the theories about what happened to Henry, I'd argue most of the credible ones tend to fall into three broad categories: accident, foul play, or that he took his own life. We'll start with this last category because I think of all of them I have the least to say about it. The only real evidence that Henry was in a bad state mentally seems to come from that part of the police report covering the discussions that investigators had with Henry's supervisor. It's certainly possible that Henry was struggling more than the people in his life realized, and if he did take his own life, he wouldn't be the first person to do so without warning or explanation. That being said, and I hate to sound cliche here, but it just seems like he had so much to live for and so many big plans for the future. Again, I realize sometimes this is how these situations play out, but there's just not a lot more I can say. In terms of an accident, I think there's a lot of compelling reasons to think this could be what happened. We have reports from a ton of people talking about how much Henry had to drink that night. And if he was intoxicated enough to lose his wallet and keys, and also demand to be dropped off at a random gas station, I think it's safe to say he probably wasn't thinking clearly. On top of this, if you look at the route Henry's phone was traveling before his GPS location cut out, he was heading in the direction of Rush Lake. It's possible that, like police said, when he got to the end of Rice Creek Road, he turned onto Long Lake Road and started heading north. Perhaps when Henry arrived at the intersection with Mississippi Street, he recognized the road name and in his intoxicated state got confused and started walking down there. If that were the case, all he would have had to do was keep walking straight and he would have ended up in that wooded area that leads to Rush Lake. Of course, this assumes that you believe that Henry was really that drunk and that his friends were telling the truth. In terms of foul play, there's a bunch of different theories. Unsurprisingly, many of them have to do with William Kennedy, since he was the last confirmed person to see Henry alive. I've heard proponents of the idea that William was involved say that even if there's footage showing that he dropped Henry off, that doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't pick him back up again. I suppose that's true, though there's still the matter of William's wife, who provided an alibi for him. There's also a part in the police report where it mentions that William directly asked police to look into pings for his cell phone that morning, saying that it would prove he was telling the truth. That seems like a very strange and foolish thing to do if you're guilty. The next most popular theory seems to be that Corinne was involved, possibly because of Henry's infidelity. However, if you'll recall, Corinne was in California at the time of Henry's disappearance. Some have gotten around this by suggesting she could have hired someone to kill her husband, though no actual evidence has ever been produced. There is that whole thing about Corinne being accused by Timothy and others of withholding evidence, but as far as I can tell, there's not much to this. In fact, you could argue the opposite. With stuff like the Google timeline thing, Corinne didn't have to notify police about this, but she did. There are plenty of other examples in the police report, too, of her reaching out with new information as soon as she gets it. The last major homicide theory I would say that's truly noteworthy is one that comes from Corinne herself, which is that Henry might have been killed by someone within the Liberian community. Again, there's no hard evidence of this, but Corinne did tell police during her conversations with them that the specific reason Henry and his brothers had to flee the country was because their father, who was involved in politics, was fatally poisoned. After that, it wasn't safe for them there. Karine floated the idea that perhaps someone with ties to the Liberian government had targeted Henry, either because they knew who his family was, or because of his political views. As I said, Henry was pretty outspoken politically, and it's at least conceivable that someone might have wanted to silence him or felt that he could be a threat in the future. There is one final loose end I want to leave you with, one that, aside from the voicemail, is probably the single biggest mystery in this case. Depending on how you look at it, it might also be the strongest piece of evidence that someone else was involved in his disappearance and death, or at least that someone knew about it. So, back when Mounds View police obtained Henry's phone records, they noticed something in the call log. It turned out that on September 7th, Henry's phone was used to call the same number 24 different times. One of these calls was placed at 3:26 a.m., almost a full hour after the voicemail was recorded. Unfortunately, this is also well after Henry's phone stopped transmitting geolocation data, so we don't know where he was when the calls were made. This isn't even the weirdest part, though. It turned out that Henry's phone continued to call this number for the next 3 days. The final call in the log was placed at 9:26 a.m. on September 10th. When police looked into this number, they discovered that it was registered to a T-Mobile customer in Texas City, Texas. They called it, only to discover that it was no longer in service. Needless to say, this leads to so many questions. Was Henry making these calls, or was someone else? For what purpose? And who did the caller think was supposed to be on the other end? The unfortunate reality is we just don't have the answers to any of these questions. And that probably won't change until some new piece of evidence is revealed or some new witness comes forward. Until then, it seems that the disappearance of Henry Toby McCabe is destined to remain a haunting mystery.
Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.